It all began with something so small, so ordinary, that most outsiders wouldn't understand why it mattered. A single parking spot. Just a stretch of asphalt painted with faded white lines directly in front of my townhouse. To anyone else, it was just a space to leave a car. To me, it was part of my daily rhythm, my comfort, my home. For 7 years, that spot had been where I ended my workdays, where I unloaded groceries, where I sat in my car for a few quiet minutes before heading inside. It wasn't legally assigned, but everyone on the block respected it as mine. No one else parked there, not once, not ever. Then one morning, everything changed. I opened my blinds, coffee in hand, and froze. My spot had been erased, not blocked, not temporarily borrowed, erased. A bold line of yellow paint stretched across the pavement, with fresh white letters stamped over it. HOA reserved. At first, I thought I was imagining it. Maybe I hadn't slept well. Maybe it was a prank. But when I walked outside to see it up close, the paint was fresh, still gleaming under the morning sun. My heart sank. My spot was gone. I called the property manager immediately, demanding answers. He didn't hesitate. The board, he explained, had voted to reallocate certain parking areas for community and official use. The phrase he used, repurposed, hit me like a slap. They had taken something that everyone in the neighborhood respected as mine and handed it over as if it were theirs to give. That evening, the truth came into focus. When I drove home from work, my headlights swept across the spot, and there it was, a shiny black SUV parked neatly in the middle. And standing beside it, clipboard in hand, was Linda, the HOA president. She didn't even pretend to look apologetic. She gave me a smile, sharp and smug, the kind that told me she'd been waiting for this moment. To her, this was just another display of her authority. Linda had always been the self-declared queen of our subdivision. She barked orders about trash can placement, sent passive-aggressive notes about holiday decorations, and fined people for the smallest infractions. She thrived on control, and now she had taken my spot simply because she could. But Linda didn't know something very important. Something I had kept to myself for years. She thought she ruled this neighborhood, but she didn't realize that her little kingdom was built on land that wasn't entirely hers to command. When I first bought my townhouse, the neighborhood was barely finished. The developer was struggling to keep the project afloat and cutting corners everywhere. While sorting through the closing paperwork, I noticed an odd parcel listed for sale, a narrow strip of land running along the front edge of the cul-de-sac. Most buyers wouldn't have cared about it, but I've always been cautious. Something about owning that frontage seemed like a smart idea, so I bought it. At the time, I didn't think it meant much. Maybe a small buffer, maybe a garden. But what I really purchased was the entire stretch of road that connected our houses to the outside world. The asphalt itself, the driveways that spilled onto it, the mailboxes lining it, all of it sat on land I owned. The county records confirmed it, the deed spelled it out, and the plat maps highlighted it. For years, I never thought about it. The HOA acted like they owned the street, and I never corrected them. I paid my dues, kept to myself, and let them play at being rulers, until they came for me. That night, I pulled out my old file cabinet and dusted off the folder from my closing day. There it was, the legal description of the parcel, with boundaries that clearly included the road. My hand shook as I reread it, not out of fear, but excitement, because suddenly everything looked different. They had stolen a parking spot from me, but I owned the ground they were standing on. I spent the next few days quietly verifying everything. I double-checked with the county assessor's office. I reviewed the subdivision's bylaws and covenants. The HOA had power over yards, fences, and house paint. But the road? The road wasn't theirs. It was mine. They had been issuing parking rules, sending violation notices, even painting stripes on my land. For years, I had tolerated their nonsense. The fines about my recycling bin not being rolled in by 10 a.m. sharp. The complaint about the solar lights in my flower bed being too distracting. Even the ridiculous warning about my Christmas decorations being excessive. I had swallowed it all, because it was easier to stay quiet. But this time was different. They had stolen something from me directly, and worse, They had laughed in my face when I asked for it back. I attended the next HOA meeting, hoping for a reasonable conversation. I raised my hand and explained that the parking spot had been mine for years. They dismissed me immediately. One board member even chuckled and said, "It's just asphalt. Nobody owns asphalt." The room laughed with him. But I didn't laugh, because I knew something they didn't. Ownership is everything, and ownership is exactly what I had. I walked out of that meeting with my head high. Let them think they had won. Let them laugh at my expense. Soon enough, the smug smiles would disappear, because I had the kind of leverage no rule book, no fine, no clipboard could compete with. I owned the very ground their power stood on, and if they thought stealing my spot was bold, they had no idea what was about to hit them. They had poked the wrong neighbor, and I was going to remind them that when you play games with property, you had better know who truly holds the deed. Power in a neighborhood rarely comes from where people think it does. Most residents assume it comes from the HOA board, the self-appointed rulers with their clipboards, their fines, their passive-aggressive newsletters about weeds and trash bins. They believe that those people, those who sit in folding chairs once a month and call themselves the board, are in charge. But real power doesn't come from rules. It doesn't come from bylaws or meeting minutes. Real power comes from ownership, and I owned the road they walked on. After that disastrous HOA meeting where they laughed me off, I went home and sat down at my desk. I laid out every piece of documentation I had, the deed, the plat map, the county assessor's notes. The facts were simple, unshakable, undeniable. The HOA had no jurisdiction over the cul-de-sac. The asphalt, the curbs, the parking strips, they were all mine. For years, the HOA had written tickets for illegal parking on this road. They had ordered residents to move cars. They had issued threats of towing. All of it was done without authority. They were operating on land they didn't control. The more I thought about it, the more outrageous it became. They had fined me for leaving a recycling bin at the curb overnight, on my curb. They had fined another neighbor for parking his camper trailer for 2 days, on my pavement. And now they had taken my personal parking spot and reassigned it to themselves, declaring it HOA reserved, as if they were monarchs dividing up land in their empire. But monarchs need subjects, and subjects only obey as long as they believe their rulers are legitimate. I was about to strip that illusion away. I began quietly. My first step was confirming the county's stance. I scheduled a meeting with the zoning department. Sitting across from a clerk, I explained that I owned a parcel of land that happened to include a private road. I asked what rights came with that ownership. She glanced at the paperwork, raised her eyebrows, and nodded. If it's private property, the HOA can't regulate it. They don't own it. You do. That single sentence was the match to gasoline. I walked out of that office practically buzzing. For years, they had strutted around as though they were untouchable, but legally they were standing on quicksand. The next step was subtle but deliberate. One Friday evening after the sun set, I walked out with a bucket of black paint and a brush. I crouched in front of the stolen spot, and with slow, steady strokes, I painted over the HOA reserved lettering, layer after layer until not a trace remained. Then, for good measure, I marked it with my initials. Nothing obvious, just a quiet reminder that this wasn't theirs to claim. The next morning, chaos erupted. Linda stormed around the cul-de-sac, clipboard in hand, demanding to know who had vandalized community property. She shouted at neighbors, snapped pictures of the blackened spot, and threatened police involvement. Watching her rage from my window was pure satisfaction. She thought she was dealing with an unruly resident. She didn't yet realize she was dealing with the property owner. But that was only the beginning. The following week, I sent a certified letter to the HOA board. In it, I laid out the facts plainly. I was the legal owner of the road. Their authority ended at the edges of my parcel. Any fines, restrictions, or parking allocations they attempted to enforce on this road were invalid. I requested they immediately cease and desist all enforcement actions regarding the street and its parking. I knew the letter would hit them like a thunderclap. HOA boards thrive on the illusion of control. Take away their territory, and suddenly they're just a handful of neighbors with clipboards and too much time. Sure enough, the emails began to circulate within days. I wasn't supposed to see them, but in a small neighborhood, gossip travels fast. They accused me of bluffing. They called me a troublemaker. One even claimed I had fabricated documents. But behind the bravado there was panic. They had operated unchecked for so long that the idea of someone holding a deed that trumped their authority left them scrambling. And I wasn't done. The next weekend, I erected a simple sign at the entrance of the cul-de-sac. In bold letters, it read, "Private road, access by permission of owner only." The reaction was immediate. Neighbors came knocking, asking what it meant. I explained, calmly and politely, that I owned the road and that while they were free to continue using it, the HOA no longer had the right to enforce rules here. Some were shocked. Some were delighted. A few, especially those loyal to Linda, accused me of lying, but all of them felt the ground shift beneath their feet. Linda, of course, was furious. She marched up to the sign the very next day, red-faced and shaking, and tried to tear it down. I watched from my window as she yanked at the post, only to realize I had cemented it deep into the ground. When it wouldn't budge, she pulled out her phone and started snapping pictures, no doubt planning her next threat-filled email. What she didn't realize was that her outrage only fueled me. Every glare, every hissed accusation, every flurry of bored emails, it all confirmed that I had struck a nerve. They weren't laughing anymore. They were scrambling. Still, I wasn't reckless. I knew this wasn't just about flexing power. It was about setting boundaries. They had stolen from me, mocked me, and treated me like a nuisance. Now, I was showing them that I wasn't just another resident subject to their whims. I was the landowner, and if they wanted to keep pushing, I had far more drastic cards left to play, because owning the road didn't just mean I could ignore their rules. It meant I could decide what the road was used for at all. Roads can be closed. Roads can be declared private access only. Roads can even be marked as unbuildable land, cutting off future development entirely. I had leverage they couldn't match, and I wasn't afraid to use it. By the time the second letter from the HOA arrived in my mailbox, it was clear they weren't just angry, they were terrified. The letter was thick, stapled in 3 sections, and filled with official-sounding language that tried to reassert their authority over the street. They cited bylaws, referenced obscure clauses about community property, and demanded that I remove the sign declaring the road private. What they didn't realize was that their bylaws couldn't override a legal deed. I didn't need to bluff. I didn't need to argue in circles about community assets. I had the paperwork that said, plainly, the road was mine. Their bylaws ended at their property lines, and the pavement outside those lines belonged to me. Still, their tone was threatening. They warned of legal action. They hinted at fines. They even accused me of endangering the neighborhood by confusing residents. Reading it made me laugh out loud. For years, they had thrived on intimidation. They had expected me to cave like so many others had before. But intimidation only works when you're powerless. And I wasn't powerless anymore. In fact, I had just discovered another weapon at my disposal. When I first realized I owned the road, I had focused only on parking and access. But as I dug deeper into the county zoning regulations, I found something far more devastating. Roads weren't just for cars. Roads were infrastructure. And in order for any neighborhood to function legally, the roads had to be approved for development. If a road was declared private and unbuildable, it meant no future construction, no expansion, no new utilities without the explicit permission of the road owner. In other words, if I wanted to, I could freeze the entire subdivision in time. No one could add a house. No one could build an addition that required new access. No one could even get certain permits approved if the road itself was flagged as restricted. It was a nuclear option. And the more the HOA pushed, the more tempting it became. I began by filing a simple request with the county. I asked them to review the road status for future development potential. I didn't frame it as revenge. I framed it as a responsible property owner concerned about infrastructure. Within weeks, I had confirmation. The road could be designated unbuildable due to its private ownership. All it required was my signature. I held that signed document in my hand like a loaded weapon, because with one stroke of a pen, I could strip the HOA of their ability to control the future of this neighborhood. The timing couldn't have been better. Around the same week, Linda held another board meeting. From my driveway, I could hear her voice carrying across the cul-de-sac as she stood at the front of her garage, addressing her loyalists. She was telling them that I was a liar, that my deed was meaningless, that the HOA would put me in my place. What she didn't realize was that while she was shouting into the wind, I was preparing to gut the very foundation of her empire. That weekend, I took the next step. I filed the paperwork and officially declared the road unbuildable. The county clerk stamped it, entered it into the record, and that was that. In one move, the HOA lost every ounce of control over future projects. Their grand plans for neighborhood improvements, expansions, and even resale leverage evaporated. Without an approved road, their dreams of boosting property values through new development were dead. The news spread quickly. Some neighbors were furious, demanding to know what I had done. But others, quietly, cautiously, thanked me. They had grown tired of Linda's reign of terror. They were tired of constant fines, endless nitpicking, and the suffocating rules that made life in the neighborhood feel like living under surveillance. For them, my move was liberation. For Linda, it was humiliation. She cornered me one afternoon in front of my house, her voice sharp and shaking with rage. Though I didn't engage, her words carried across the street. She accused me of destroying the community. She called me selfish, vindictive, even evil. But all I heard was desperation. She had lost her control, and now she was grasping at straws. The board tried one last desperate move. They sent out an emergency newsletter claiming that my actions were illegitimate and urging residents to band together to fight me. But the cracks were already showing. Several neighbors had stopped paying HOA dues, questioning why they should fund an organization that couldn't even control the street. Others began openly parking wherever they pleased, ignoring HOA notices, knowing I had their back. It was the beginning of a quiet rebellion. What the HOA had underestimated was how fragile their power really was. For years they had ruled by fear of fines, fear of confrontation, fear of being ostracized. But once I exposed that their authority had limits, the fear began to dissolve. Neighbors who had once cowered at Linda's clipboard now rolled their eyes when she walked by. They knew the emperor had no clothes, but I wasn't done. Declaring the road unbuildable was a major strike, but I still had more cards to play. Because owning the road didn't just give me control over development, it gave me control over access. And if the HOA kept pushing, I could do something that would end their charade entirely. I could restrict their use of the road altogether. I hadn't pulled that trigger yet. I wanted to give the board time to realize the truth and back down. But every angry letter, every hollow threat, every red-faced rant from Linda only pushed me closer to it. For the first time in years, I felt in control. Not just of a parking spot, but of the entire balance of power in the neighborhood. They had stolen something from me, mocked me, and treated me as if I didn't matter. Now they were the ones scrambling, the ones writing desperate letters, the ones whispering in panic, and I was just getting started. By the time this war had played out, the HOA was running out of options. They had lost the ability to control parking. They had lost credibility with the residents, and with the road now legally declared unbuildable, they had lost their grip on the future of the neighborhood. But people like Linda don't go down quietly. They cling to control like it's oxygen. And when they feel it slipping away, they don't surrender. They lash out. It started with a letter from a law firm. Thick envelope, embossed header, full of legal jargon meant to intimidate. The HOA had apparently pooled money from residents' dues to hire an attorney. The letter accused me of trespassing against community property, of falsely asserting ownership, and of causing material harm to property values. They demanded I remove my private road sign and cease further disruption. Reading it was almost funny. Trespassing? On my own land? Falsely asserting ownership, when I had the deed stamped and filed with the county. It was nothing but a scare tactic. They thought that by slapping some legalese on letterhead, they could make me back down. But I didn't back down. Instead, I responded with my own attorney, one who was more than happy to remind them of reality. The response letter was simple, clear, and brutal. The HOA had no jurisdiction over the road, no legal grounds for fines, and no standing to accuse me of trespass. If they continued, they risked a countersuit for harassment and mismanagement of funds. The silence that followed was golden. They had tried to play the legal card, and it had backfired spectacularly, but Linda wasn't done. A week later, she staged what she called an emergency community meeting. She plastered flyers on doors, sent out a barrage of emails, and marched up and down the street urging people to attend. The meeting was a spectacle. Neighbors gathered on folding chairs in her driveway as she shouted about how I was destroying the community. She claimed that property values would plummet, that safety was at risk, that my ownership of the road was a technicality being weaponized. But here's the thing. Her voice was desperate, not commanding. She was losing her grip, and the residents knew it. Some rolled their eyes. Some whispered among themselves. Others simply walked away. And that's when I decided it was time to escalate. Because while they were busy pointing fingers and shouting, I was holding the ultimate card. Access. Owning the road didn't just mean I could paint over their reserved parking spots. It meant I controlled who used it, when, and how. Without my permission, no one technically had the right to drive on it. Of course, I had no intention of blocking my neighbors. They weren't my enemies. But the HOA? The HOA was another story, so I drew up a plan. A bold one. On a crisp Saturday morning, I installed 2 sturdy posts at the entrance to the cul-de-sac. Between them, I hung a large, professional-looking sign, private property, road access, restricted, unauthorized HOA activity. Prohibited, it wasn't a gate, not yet, but it was enough. It made a statement. This road was mine, and I could decide who had access. The neighborhood buzzed with gossip. Some were thrilled, whispering that the HOA had finally met its match. Others were nervous, wondering what it meant for deliveries, visitors, or future sales. But everyone understood the message. The balance of power had shifted, and the HOA was no longer in charge. Linda, predictably, lost her mind. She stormed up to the sign, waving her phone as she recorded herself ranting about illegal harassment. She screamed that I couldn't restrict access. She shouted that she'd call the sheriff. And she did. When the deputy arrived, clipboard in hand, I calmly showed him my deed. He read it, nodded, and turned to Linda with the kind of weary look reserved for people who waste police time. "Ma'am," he said, "this is private property. He can put up a sign if he wants." Then he left. Watching Linda deflate in that moment was priceless. The very authorities she had always threatened to call had just sided with me. Her power, once absolute, had crumbled. But the real blow was still to come. A few days later, a contractor truck arrived in the neighborhood. They were supposed to begin preliminary work on a small expansion project the HOA had been planning for months, an extension of the parking lot behind the cul-de-sac. But when they saw my sign and reviewed the property lines, they refused to proceed. "We can't build on private property without the owner's approval," the foreman told Linda flatly. That project was dead before it even started. And with that, the unbuildable designation of the road became more than just words on paper. It became a brick wall that the HOA couldn't climb. No future projects, no improvements, no expansions. Every dream Linda had of leaving a legacy as HOA president evaporated overnight. I should have felt satisfied, but instead, I felt a strange calm. The fight wasn't over, but I had shifted it so completely in my favor that they no longer had a path forward. The neighbors saw it too. Some began to openly defy the HOA, refusing to pay dues, parking wherever they pleased, even decorating their houses however they liked. The spell was broken, and me? I was already thinking of the next step. Because if Linda and her cronies kept pushing, I could go further, much further. The posts I had installed could easily support a gate, a real one that locked. And if it came to that, I could make the HOA beg me for the keys to their own street. The thought alone made me smile. They had stolen my parking spot. They had mocked me, fined me, and dismissed me. And in return, I had taken their authority, their projects, and their future. But the fight wasn't quite over. Not yet, because if they wanted to keep playing games, I still had one more card left to play. A card that could end the HOA for good. By the time the 4th month of this battle rolled around, the HOA wasn't just weakened, it was splintering from the inside. The once smug and untouchable board had become a cluster of frantic emails, panicked meetings, and hollow threats. Linda still strutted through the neighborhood with her clipboard, but her authority had turned into a performance. Everyone could see it. The queen of the cul-de-sac had no throne left to sit on. It started small. One of my neighbors down the street, a man named Derek, parked his work truck in his front yard, something the HOA had fined him for repeatedly over the years. This time, when the violation notice showed up on his door, he crumpled it up and tossed it into the street. No payment, no apology, no compliance. The HOA barked, but Derek didn't budge. And when nothing happened, no towing, no enforcement, other neighbors noticed. Then another family decided to paint their front door a bright teal, even though the HOA's handbook clearly restricted colors to neutral earth tones. Again, Linda sent letters. Again, they ignored them. Again, nothing happened. One by one, the residents began to realize the truth. The HOA had no teeth anymore. They couldn't enforce rules on property they didn't control, and without the road, without the foundation of their power, their influence was unraveling. The rebellion spread like wildfire. Trash cans stayed out for days. Christmas lights went up early and stayed up well past New Year's. Lawns grew shaggy. Driveways filled with boats, campers, and extra vehicles. The rigid, suffocating order that Linda had spent years building collapsed into a kind of joyous chaos. And I didn't have to lift a finger. I just watched from my window as the neighborhood freed itself. But not everyone was happy. For the residents who had always sided with Linda, who believed the HOA was the guardian of their property values, the changes felt like the end of civilization. They clung to her words, repeated her warnings about falling home prices, and insisted that without her control, the neighborhood would descend into ruin. But their numbers were shrinking. For every loyalist shouting about community standards, 3 more were grilling in their front yard with music blasting and not a care in the world. Linda, of course, fought harder than ever. She increased the number of newsletters, filling them with bold red warnings and threats of escalated action. She claimed she was working with county officials to override my ownership. She told residents not to listen to false rumors about the road. But the more she shouted, the less people listened. And that's when I decided to make my next move. I had hinted at it before, but now it was time to make it real. The gate. The posts I had installed at the entrance of the cul-de-sac were already solid, anchored in concrete. It wouldn't take much to add a crossbar and a locking mechanism. It didn't even have to be closed all the time. The very existence of a gate would send a message. Access was conditional, and I held the key. I hired a contractor independently, without telling anyone, and within a week, a gleaming metal gate stood at the entrance. It wasn't massive or ostentatious, just a simple swing gate with a lockbox. I left it open during the day but closed it at night. And just like that, the power dynamic shifted again. The neighborhood erupted. Some neighbors were delighted, saying it kept out traffic and made the street safer. Others were furious, demanding to know why they had to drive through a locked gate to get home. And Linda? She nearly exploded. She stood at the gate the very first evening, rattling it, shouting that I had no right to block her community. But the truth was written in black and white on the deed I carried in my filing cabinet. I had every right. When delivery trucks arrived, they called me for access. When utility workers needed to get in, they called me. And with every call, the residents realized something. If you wanted to live here, if you wanted access, you weren't dealing with the HOA anymore. You were dealing with me. That realization cut deep into Linda's empire. Residents who had once paid dues out of fear now began asking why they were paying at all. If the HOA couldn't control the road, couldn't enforce parking, couldn't manage access, then what were they even funding? The rebellion wasn't just about ignoring rules anymore. It was about dismantling the HOA itself. Within weeks, half the residents stopped paying dues. The HOA's budget dried up. The landscapers they hired stopped showing up. The community pool went without maintenance. The clubhouse, once Linda's pride, sat dark and empty. And for the first time, I saw fear in Linda's eyes. It wasn't the fear of me, or even of losing control of the road. It was the fear of irrelevance. She had built her identity on ruling this neighborhood. Without her clipboard, without her fines, without her board meetings, she was just another homeowner. And she couldn't stand it. The night it all came to a head, I was closing the gate when Linda marched up, flanked by two of her remaining loyalists. She pointed at me and declared, loud enough for the whole street to hear, that I was destroying everything. That without her leadership, the neighborhood would collapse. That I was selfish, vindictive, and power-hungry. But as she shouted, porch lights flicked on. Doors opened. Neighbors gathered. And one by one, they started telling her the truth. They told her they were tired of her fines, tired of her threats, tired of living under her constant surveillance. They told her that maybe the neighborhood didn't need an HOA anymore. The look on her face as her own subjects turned on her was something I'll never forget. The rebellion wasn't quiet anymore. It was loud, undeniable, and final. The HOA was collapsing, and I had one last decision to make, whether to let it die slowly or to finish it myself. The rebellion had reached its peak. The HOA board was shattered, the budget was gone, and residents had tasted the freedom they never thought possible. But there was one last thread left uncut. The HOA still legally existed. Linda still clung to her title as president, still waved her clipboard, and still tried to squeeze some ounce of authority out of the ruins. For me, it wasn't enough to watch her empire crumble slowly. I wanted closure, finality. The kind of ending that would make sure no one in this neighborhood or any HOA within earshot would ever forget what happened here. I began quietly gathering signatures. The HOA bylaws allowed for dissolution of the association if 2/3 of homeowners agreed. With the road under my control and the community already revolting, I knew I could get the numbers. It didn't take much convincing. When I knocked on doors and presented the petition, people signed eagerly. Some even asked if they could sign twice. They were tired of fines, tired of Linda, tired of the entire charade. By the time I had a majority, word spread. Linda caught wind of it, of course, and went into overdrive. She flooded inboxes with pleas and threats. She warned residents that without the HOA, their homes would lose half their value. She claimed insurance rates would skyrocket, that the neighborhood would fall into crime and decay. But these were empty words. From a woman who no longer had the ability to tow a single car or demand a single check. The night of the final HOA meeting was the nail in the coffin. It was supposed to be her show of strength, a last-ditch attempt to rally her loyalists. She called the meeting in the community clubhouse, the one already half abandoned since the budget dried up. But when the night arrived, the parking lot was nearly empty. Only a handful of diehards showed. The rest of the neighborhood, they were at my house. I hadn't planned a party, but that's what it turned into. Folding chairs lined my yard. Neighbors brought coolers and food. Kids ran around laughing while adults raised drinks to a new chapter of freedom. And in the middle of it all sat the petition, covered in signatures, a document that would officially dissolve the HOA forever. Linda drove past once, saw the crowd, and didn't even stop. She knew, everyone knew. It was over. The legal filing was almost anticlimactic. I sent the petition to the county clerk, paid a small processing fee, and within weeks, the HOA was legally terminated. No more dues, no more board, no more Linda with her clipboard. Just a neighborhood of homeowners, finally free. But even as the paperwork cleared, I wasn't done. The road was still mine, and with it came responsibility. I had the power to keep the gate locked, to demand fees for access, to essentially become my own version of an HOA dictator. Some neighbors worried that I might replace Linda with myself. After all, power has a way of twisting people, but I had never wanted control over them. I just wanted freedom, for myself and for all of us. So I did something no one expected. I called another meeting, not in a clubhouse, but in my driveway. Every homeowner was invited, and when they gathered, I made the announcement. I was donating the road to the residents equally and permanently. Each homeowner would receive shared ownership. No board, no precedent, no dues. Just collective ownership of the land we all lived on. The reaction was explosive. Cheers erupted. Some people cried. Others hugged me. For years, they had lived under the thumb of someone who treated them like children. And here I was, handing them freedom on a silver platter. Linda didn't show her face that night. Rumor had it she was already looking to sell her house and move somewhere else, someplace with another HOA where she could try to reclaim her crown. But here she was finished. Her reign was over. In the months that followed, the neighborhood transformed. Not into chaos, as Linda had predicted, but into something better. People began talking to each other, working things out neighbor to neighbor instead of calling in a board to mediate. Some kept their lawns perfect. Others let them grow wild with flowers. No one cared. Property values didn't plummet. If anything, they rose. Buyers liked the idea of no HOA fees and no micromanagement. The gate stayed for a while, mostly as a reminder. We left it open, but every time someone drove past, they remembered the battle that had been fought here. A symbol of what happens when people push back against control. For me, it was the sweetest victory I could have imagined. Not because I had beaten Linda, not because I had humiliated the HOA, but because I had proven something bigger, that these organizations, built on intimidation and petty power, only survive as long as people believe in them. The second you take away their foundation, they collapse like a house of cards. Looking back, I realized how poetic it was. They stole a parking spot from me, a single space, a small act of arrogance. And in return, I took their entire world. I took the road beneath their feet, the foundation of their control, and turned it against them. Sometimes revenge isn't loud. Sometimes it isn't a confrontation in the street or a screaming match at a meeting. Sometimes it's quiet, methodical, written in deeds and signatures. Sometimes the best revenge is simply the truth, wielded at the right time. And that's exactly what I did. Today, the neighborhood lives in peace. Kids ride bikes without fear of being fined for leaving toys on the lawn. Families decorate however they want. People live freely, without the constant shadow of someone measuring grass or judging paint colors. And every time I park my car in the spot the HOA once claimed for themselves, I smile. Because that single space sparked a revolution. Linda may have believed she owned the community, but in the end, I owned the road. And that made all the difference. And that brings us to the end of today's story. A stolen parking spot, a hidden deed, and an HOA that learned the hard way what happens when power is abused. If you enjoyed this tale of petty rules, bold revenge, and ultimate justice, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with someone who loves a good HOA drama as much as you do. Your support helps us bring you even more unbelievable stories just like this one. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.